Rockingham County government presents You've Got Grit. You've Got Grit, David Spear of Madison, North Carolina. Grit is the raw endurance, perseverance, and passion that keeps you going despite obstacles. You've got grit. David Spear of Madison, North Carolina. Tell us, who is David M. Spear of Madison, North Carolina?
Oh me, oh me. I don't know about that, Mabel. Uh, I am a Rockingham County native. Grew up and I've lived most of my life here in Madison and surrounding area. And for years and years, I was, I've been here. I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about what Madison was like when I was a kid, because at that time, I was born in 1937, and we were up on our feet and running around by 1940 and 41. This is right about the time World War II started. At that time, most of the vehicle travel in North Carolina was in Rockingham County was mule-drawn wagons. And you'd go to town on Saturday, and the town would be covered over with mule-drawn wagons and very few cars. It's hard to imagine that, but that's exactly the way that world was. It was very, very, it was idyllic in one sense, Mabel, because we didn't have all the pressure that kids today have. We ran free in town. We didn't worry about being kidnapped. We didn't worry about all the problems that, we have in our culture today. And also, back then, just about all the roads were dirt. Only the main highways were paved. And that changed in 1949 when Governor Kerry Scott got elected. He mandated. He said, "We're going to get North Carolina out of the mud, and we're going to pave these roads in North Carolina and bring this state up to par." And he did. He was known as the governor who paved the roads in North Carolina. I'll tell you a very interesting story that happened in 1947, right after World War II. My dad announced at the supper table one night, it was in the summer, it was August 1947, that we were going downtown after supper to witness the latest invention. And he said he didn't even have a name for it. He said it's a little box that shows pictures with people's faces and they're talking. And so anyway, we all got up and went downtown, and there was a B.F. Goodrich store down there, and they had a little television in the window, and it was about maybe 10 inches square, and you could see it was really, it was not very clear at all. It was black and white, and you could just make out the image of a man's head in it. And this was coming out of WFMY TV over in Greensboro. They had a studio in downtown Greensboro. It was really right next to the old Greensboro Daily News office building. And it was just the studio was 4 walls. It was a square box with a camera in the middle of it. And they'd go from one wall would be news, the next wall would be weather, and the next wall would be maybe a cooking show or whatever they had on schedule. But when we got through looking at that thing, went on back home, my dad, he told my mom, he said, "There'll never be a television set in our house." And I think he understood the implications of what television was going to mean for people in our society. I think he ascertained that television was probably the most powerful propaganda instrument that had ever been devised by man. So as long as he was alive, we never had TV in our home. About a month after he died, my mom bought a television set. And she swore, she said, I won't look at any of that commercial junk. I'll look at public television. But she did love to watch Jeopardy. That was her favorite program on television. And she'd watch PBS, but she didn't, other than that, that's all she looked at. But getting back to television, you know, at the time, like so many things that had been thrust upon our culture, nobody really thought about the implications, you know, how is this going to impact our culture? And, you know, we know now that television is just about decimated the American ability to read and use the English language. It's just, you know, it's been a monster in that respect. And it's also a device that you can create. You can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with television. You're just seeing visual images. You don't know what you're really seeing. So, but anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. And but that was a wonderful world we grew up with. We ran free. We played at night, played out in the streets. We lived on a dirt road. And of course, we learned to swim in the river and built forts and camped out. It was an idyllic life. It was a wonderful life.
Now we hear you are also into photography and you're an author and a former publisher. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, our family ran the Messenger, a weekly newspaper in Madison, for 50 years. And we were a very democratic newspaper, very progressive, very liberal. And if you can imagine being a very liberal newspaper, and of course my dad was from up north, so he was considered a Yankee. And, you know, people were, they were possibly a little bit suspect of him, but he had very liberal and very progressive ideas, and it didn't always sit well in the community. And thinking back on that period of time while we were in the newspaper business, I would think that there was sort of a love-hate relationship with people in town about the newspaper. I think we had 50% of the people in town who really loved us and what we believed in, and then we had a large group of very conservative people who hated us, and they wanted to get rid of us. And they actually did come after us. In 1978, a group of businessmen formed a new newspaper to try to put us out of business, and didn't succeed. It just made us work harder and made us better. And but it was a lot of it had to do with our stand on integration, school integration, and you know, there were people that were just, you know, they were really, well, racism was. I thought when Barack Obama got elected that, you know, we'd settle the issue of racism in this country. Little did I realize that we hadn't at all, and that was unfortunate. But anyway, that we ran a good, honest, strong newspaper, and we had a wonderful readership. And whether they liked us or not, they read the paper. I think when I sold that newspaper in 1984, we had a circulation of over 9,000 copies. And so we had wide readership, and people used to line up on Wednesday right outside the messenger office. There'd be a long line of people waiting to get their hands on a newspaper. So it was a vital instrument at that time. And in the early days of newspapering, my mom and dad knew nothing about newspaper, and they bought it with the help of my mother's brother in 1934, and they had no idea how to run a newspaper. And looking back at some of the stories that they wrote at the time, it's very, very interesting the way they approached news articles. Of course, back then there wasn't any television. Give an example of what I'm saying. When there would be a story, of a crime story of any nature, the police officers would come to the messenger office and tell my dad or whoever was going to write the story, they'd give them all the story and all the details. It was like they were really wanted it in the paper, and they wanted their name in the paper. Of course, contrast that with what's going on today. You can't get a police officer, they don't want to tell anybody anything anymore. If you're a news reporter, you go and ask a police officer and say, well, we're not at liberty to give out that information, so it's harder. I'll tell you a story that's sort of indicative of that period. Right after I first started working, I went to work with the newspaper in 1963. And I hadn't been working very long, and I got a call. It was from a man who ran a store in Sandy Ridge. He said, there's been a murder up here. I just thought I'd let you know. And so I got in the car and I went flying on up there. I stopped at his store, and he told me where the house was, and I drove up, and there was nobody there when I pulled into the driveway. And just as soon as I pulled in, this man stepped out on a side porch and waved toward me to come in the house. So I got out of the car and walked up there. And he said, come on in the house and have a cup of coffee with me. And so he proceeded to tell me he'd just murdered his wife. And I was sitting there in the kitchen with him drinking a cup of coffee and thinking, oh my gosh, if he knows I'm a newspaper man, he's probably going to shoot me. He was just nice as he could be. And he was apparently some kind of crime of compassion. But anyway, we sat there for a while, and a little bit later, the sheriff of Stokes County, who was Harvey Johnson at the time, he pulled in the driveway. And so this man, he got up and he walked out on the porch, and Harvey never got out of his car. He's a sheriff. He rolled down the window of his car, and he said, you know what you got to do, don't you? He said, when you get everything squared away, after the coroner comes up, he said, I want you to come on down to Danbury because we got to go to jail. And the man said, okay. He said, now compare that attitude toward the way things are today. Something like that happens today, you're going to see 15 police cars, yellow tape. And it's just, of course, it's a different world now. But back then, there were a lot fewer people, and people knew. They understood people. They understood human nature. I'll give you another example of something I witnessed that sort of demonstrates this. There was apparently it was a domestic feud, and somebody had called the police office and said there's a man with a gun in a house over here in Medan, and he's threatening. And so anyway, by the time I got there were two deputy cars there and a Medan police car, and the officers were down behind the cars with their guns up over the hood of the car pointing toward the house. And pretty soon here comes Paul Case. He was chief of police in Madison, and he was a very, very smart police officer. He just pulls right up, got out of his car, and they're all sitting behind the cars with the guns pulled. He walked right past all of them, walked up to the house and knocked on the door. Man opened the door and he went inside. He was inside for about 5 minutes, and he came out and had the man with him, no gun, anything, walked him right down, got in the car and went off. And I thought, this man really knows how to do it. he understands people. He understands human nature. You know, he understands that everybody's not their enemy. You know, and you won't find anything going on like that today, unfortunately.
You've had some wonderful stories that you're sharing with us. So, what's really important in life?
Well, one of the most important things, I think, well, of course, I mean, you could say right off the top, it's always important to be happy, but it's important to, I think, for each and every one of us to understand that we're all in this game together. We're all, you know, we're here one another, and we're here to help one another out. In our country, you know, I witnessed that firsthand during the World War II. There was a concerted together effort. Everybody pulled together, everybody worked together. And, you know, it was just remarkable how, and, you know, we've gotten so far away from that now, this sense of, and I'm not sure exactly what happened to cause it. You know, I think one of the things that may have contributed to the problem is that when they dropped the military draft, I don't care whether I think that America should have a program where young kids, 16, 17, well, when they're 18 years old, to give 2 years of service, whether it be public service or military service, so they understand that they are part of a larger picture. You know, they're not just floating around out there. You know, we've got a country, and we're all part of it, and we need to work together. And after they dropped the drafts, I think that was the beginning of this sort of breakup of the sense of cohesion that our country had before. And but I don't know, but you know, we all want to be happy. And
So, why do you love Rockingham County?
well, I love the people here, and I love the terrain. It's a beautiful county, and you know, we got beautiful rivers, beautiful mountains, beautiful. It's a nice area, and it's got a very temperate climate. It's not too terribly cold, although it's been pretty cold the last couple of weeks. So you know, you have a good seasonal diversity, which makes it nice. You know, it's always wonderful in the springtime when the beautiful green starts coming into the trees, and you know, you start thinking about time to go plant something. And that, you know, we did that back, you know, 60, 70 years ago during World War II. Everybody had a garden, and we all raised our own food, and we even raised hogs in town. I can't imagine anybody, you know, raising hogs over in town in Madison now, but it was, they called them victory gardens. And of course, they had canneries back then too, Mabel. And people, you know, they would raise tomatoes and okra and beans and all kinds of stuff. And there was a big cannery up there near Stoneville, and we'd all go up there and can the stuff, so you had food year round. And so you can kind of, you know, I've seen a lot of change. You know, I was born before television, and not too long after we just got the radio going. You know, before that it was telegraph. Before that it was carrier pigeons. And of course, the advent of the jet plane, that was a phenomenon. I know we used to go down to Greensboro, And we would sit out on that little platform down at that old airport just to watch those jet planes. We just couldn't imagine that a plane, you know, all that big old heavy metal plane could get off the ground and fly through the air. You know, it was just a phenomenal thing. And yeah, the jet age. I worked in television for about 2 years in the early part of the 60s. And that was right when television was going through this advent of going from black and white to color. And when I worked over there for the television station, that was 61, 62, and into the early part of 63. This was when all the civil rights activity was going on in Greensboro, and we covered that. And that was an interesting time too, because the news director at the station then, he had real close connection with James Farmer and a lot of the leading civil rights activists at that time. And no matter where there was a civil rights demonstration, he knew, and it was covered. And then, of course, we had people in the station that were angry with the news department because they said we wasn't doing anything but stirring up trouble. And that there was a lot of tension going on. But, you know, that was a pivotal time, you know, with the rise of Martin Luther King and ultimately, you know, civil rights acts in 1964 and the civil rights, voting rights in 1965. But that was a really horrendous time in this country. People don't realize that now. You know, you remember it very well, I know.
Yes. We just want to thank you for these beautiful stories that you've shared with us today. And this is why someone suggested that David Spear of Madison, North Carolina, he's got grit. David Spear of Madison, North Carolina, he's got grit. We bet some of you watching this show probably know someone else who you describe by saying, you've got grit. What we'd like you to do is to email us a paragraph describing the person you think Spectrum 1304 should interview for You've Got Grit. Please email your paragraph to mscott@co.rockingham.nc.us. That's mscott@co.rockingham.nc.us. Thanks for joining us. You've got grit.